where I'm walking and I see a man with a machete swinging it. And to me, that's very scary. So I would call 911. It takes about 45 minutes for the police to come out. And when they get there, they said, he really isn't doing anything wrong. There's nothing they can do. That they called dual residency. So somebody has a bed inside the shelter and then they have a tent outside. And that's how they were able to show us that, our resources were not being, ill spent for freedom. That's really what it comes down to. They want to be able to use drugs openly outside. It's really about their freedom. The drug dealers have really moved in. They dominate these areas. For the drug dealers, it's great to have encampments because you sort of have people corralled in an area. If a suspect is running and they run into a tent, they cannot follow that individual into a tent. They would need a search warrant, just as they would to enter a home. Okay, my name is Soledad Ursua. I live in Venice Beach. I am an elected member to our neighborhood council. And one of the reasons that I ran for a seat on the board was because I'm an everyday resident who became so concerned with our growing homeless population. Venice Beach, we're right on the Pacific Ocean. It's a neighborhood of about 3.5 miles. But today we have over 2,000 unsheltered homeless individuals on our streets. We are now second to that of Skid Row. So this is Skid Row West, and it has affected our everyday life.
So Skid Row, people may say, well, they have historical reasons. They always had a large homeless population, but Venice Beach, Venice Beach does not strike me as some place that you always had a homeless problem.
We had a small homeless problem, and I used to live in New York. It never bothered me. I was used to it. I think most areas have homeless communities, but we saw it really spiral out of control. And one of the big issues is the drug. It's meth now. And so it's very violent. We're seeing increase in robberies, break-ins, attacks. There's disputes over drugs gone wrong. The drug dealers have moved in. It's a supply and demand issue. So we've really kind of been hostage to really what is a drug crisis unfolding on our streets.
So is it safe to walk outside at night, especially for women and children?
I do not go outside past dusk. We had about 200 tents on the Venice boardwalk. That was probably about the most dangerous it had been. Those have since been moved, but what you see happen is the problem just moves on to different areas. But most residents, you don't want to be out past dusk. And then another problem is, in California, we leave our mentally ill people on the streets. That's how we treat them. And what is so dangerous here is that you could walk by someone and you don't know what's going on with them. They could be arguing with someone who they believe is real. And in that process, you could end up getting attacked. We're seeing this happen all over Los Angeles. If you may remember, there was a 24-year-old who was stabbed to death. This was in a nicer area as well, because so we haven't had that here in Venice, but you don't know what could happen. You don't know what somebody's going through. And as a result, you could be yourself a victim.
She was working just in the furniture store. And then I couldn't imagine how terrified she must be by herself in that store that morning.
And what's so sad too is you hear that she had texted one of her friends that something didn't feel right. That's how we feel a lot of times. I will be walking and I just know that something is wrong with someone and I will text somebody that same thing. So I think that's sort of the saddest to hear that we have our own natural instincts. We know when we're at risk, and yet our politicians just dismiss all of our, cries and worries, and they tell us that there's nothing to be worried of. But we know when something is fundamentally wrong.
And, a lot of times we think, politicians, they are voted into the office to represent the people, right? And then now the people are having voices and having this dissatisfaction about quality of life. So why do the politicians in office are not listening to us?
I think it's really about their politics. In Los Angeles, we have 15 city council members. They act as mini mayors, so they direct policing in their own districts. I live in Council District 11. My council member is Mike Bonin. He is the most progressive city council member. He's often referred to as the AOC of Los Angeles, and he has told the police to stand down. He sees homelessness as a crisis of poverty and housing shortage. So he just does not fundamentally believe what we see. And that's sort of the problem. So it's really up to your council member, what police resources are made available, what crimes will be enforced, and what enforcement, if any, will go on.
Is there any prospect that we could vote him out?
Well, he is technically up for re-election. He has decided that he will not run again. So that's a big sign, because traditionally an incumbent will win in LA city politics. What we suspect has happened is he did polling and he's just dropped very unfavorably. So he would have no chance to win, but he has said that he is not running for re-election. So that is a huge shakeup in Los Angeles politics.
Right. What about the police? Would they come out to help you guys?
It has been so hard. We really did defund our police back in 2020. And a lot of things what happened too was crimes, they've been downgraded. For instance, we no longer prosecute trespassing, human defecation, loitering. Many of the crimes that you see today, now they're considered quality of life issues. I have been in a situation where I'm walking and I see a man with a machete swinging it. And to me, that's very scary. So I would call 911. It takes about 45 minutes for the police to come out. And when they get there, they said, he really isn't doing anything wrong. There's nothing they can do. It's just, so, we're in a position now where we'd almost have to wait for him to actually hurt somebody to arrest. And that's sort of, that's something bigger in politics. It's with our DA, George Gascon. He just does not want to prosecute many, minor offenses. And for us as residents, people are nonviolent until they are violent. And so it really just feels so risky walking around.
Right. I feel the same way. I mean, just several weeks ago, that incident in New York subway, when the man attacked the Asian woman and pushed her off the subway and got hit by a train. And he was shouting that he was God. And something definitely was mentally wrong with that man. But before that incident happened, he was just a normal homeless person, and nobody intervened or nobody checked on him to make sure he was okay.
Even the murder of Brianna Cooper, the 24-year-old student, he had been arrested over a 10-year period in multiple states. And when you look at his arrest record, there wasn't really anything violent. It was a lot of, or I think it was some theft. But so we really see that, people are relatively nonviolent until they snap. And that could be a result of the drugs. The drugs that are coming in are just so different today. Really, in Venice Beach, it is meth, and it puts people through some sort of violent psychosis. And that's really, the really scary thing that we see going on.
So do you see that just outside on your streets on a daily basis where, people get into some kind of psychotic episode? It's
so, just disappointing to see the way that we treat our most vulnerable people. You will see people arguing with themselves. It's so common. You might see it multiple times a day. My neighbor, this past weekend, she had somebody camped outside her house. He just had a blanket over him, and our sidewalks are very small. And so, it's scary to walk by her. She's living there. She's a renter. There's nobody that she can really call, because the police will not come out for that anymore, because he's legally not doing anything wrong. But we see it as just this potential for someone to, get really hurt, or he could be a threat to himself. He could walk out into the street and get hit by a car. And so we see that we're leaving the most vulnerable people out on the streets. And, what are we expecting to happen?
So what should we do? We know California has a severe shortage of psychiatric facilities and psychiatric beds. So we don't have a place to provide inpatient psychiatric treatment to people who have mental illness. What can we do?
Well, one of the things that Los Angeles has done is they keep pushing permanent supportive housing. In 2016, there was a bond measure, Prop HHH, that was passed. It was passed by an overwhelming near 80% of voters, and that issued $1.2 billion in bond obligation to, create permanent supportive housing. A recent audit just came out by Controller Ron Galpern. It's his 2022 audit. It comes as an update to his original 2019 audit. And we find that only, out of the 10,000 goal for housing, only about 1,100 are created. It's less than 10% what was promised. And what we're finding is that it can take 6 years or so to build permanent supportive housing. So the city has really pushed this route. What they've ignored is immediate and temporary shelter that's available right away. We just went through COVID. Think about all the commercial spaces that are vacant right now. Look, we really do need a FEMA-like response to just get people off of the streets. We recently hosted the Super Bowl in LA. I'm pretty sure that stadium holds 80,000 people. There is plenty of space, and it's just shocking that our politicians have not come up with a better solution. But we need to get people off of the streets immediately. We also have LAX. There's plenty of federal land. Legally, the feds need to provide federal land to cities if there is a homeless crisis. So there's so much land at our disposal, and yet our city elected officials, they just push the slowest and most expensive route.
Right, I've read about that controller's report for Proposition HHH. It costs about like 400,000 to 500,000 per unit.
Yeah, I believe that the average cost is about 600,000 now. And there's even one project in the pipeline at 837,000. And remember, this is per unit. So we're talking, some of these are studio and one bedroom. Actually, I think about the majority, about 80% of all the units are, they're one bedroom or, studio. So we're talking about like 500 square feet. Yeah. And so people never look at the cost on a per square foot basis. That's really what we should be looking at. And I think if we did that, I think it would just really shock people.
Right. So spend that in the example you just mentioned, 800,000 per unit, and you house at most a family of 4, right? But you could
really, a lot of these are, studio and one bedroom. So we're talking about one person.
One person. So instead, you could have spent the 800,000 to house a lot more people in the shelter environment. But a lot of times people say, oh, shelters are not pleasant. They're not safe. They have lots of rules. So what do you think about that?
Well, that's why people are still on the streets, because we have created shelters, but there's no obligation to use them. One of the problems, so that video that I sent you, that was a bridge housing Venice. So that was created and it opened in 2020, and we have 154 beds there. What happened all of a sudden, COVID hit, and that exacerbated everything in Los Angeles because we stopped enforcing many of our municipal codes in order to slow the spread of COVID. What happened was CDC guidance was misused. They told people that you should not break down tents or ask people to move because people need to shelter in place. Meanwhile, there was no sheltering in place. People were moving about freely. And so, prior to COVID, tents needed to come down during the day from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. So we stopped enforcing that. We saw just this explosion of tents. Additionally, cars, you're not allowed to sleep in your car overnight, and RVs, they had to move at least once a week due to street cleaning. So we stopped enforcement of all of that because, they wanted to let people shelter in place. Today, 2 years later, we still have RVs on our street that have been there since March 2020. And so we saw even more RVs come in. So when you stop enforcing any of your rules, you just see this mass explosion. And we found people coming from so many different states because they could really do, and you can't blame these people. If you're not going to enforce any of your laws, of course, you're going to have people show up here. And so that's sort of just what happened. It was the perfect storm, right? Of just not being able to enforce any laws on your books. Right. And then what we even saw with bridge housing was that people didn't want to go into the shelter. And so the shelter was running largely empty. So bridge housing created this new metric, this new term that they called dual residency. So somebody has a bed inside the shelter and then they have a tent outside. And that's how they were able to show us that, our resources were not being, ill spent. And so for us, the residents, that's not what we were told or agreed to. So that was incredibly frustrating to hear that they had, created this new metric now to explain that people had, resources inside, but they still had tents outside.
Well, if they have a bed in the shelter, why do they still want to keep a tent outside?
For freedom. That's really what it comes down to. They want to be able to use drugs openly outside. It's really about their freedom.
And then the city leaders are not saying anything about, well, if you have a bed inside, you are not allowed to have a tent outside.
I think for them, they just don't want to admit that it's not working. And that's kind of the problem that we run into, where the problem has just exacerbated beyond control. Our population is spiking, and it's because no one is willing to admit, hey, we might need to do something new.
Right. Based on your observation, like roughly what percentage of unsheltered homeless persons on the street are from out of California or maybe out of the LA area?
So I've talked to a bunch of residents around here. We expect about 70% are out of state. I recently went to the Tenderloin. I went to go check out the new Linkage Center that opened. And I did a tour with somebody who represented the Tenderloin Merchants Association. And he showed me around, and I asked him, what percent do you think are out of state? And he responded 95%. That most of the people coming are from the Midwest because meth is rampant there, and they find their way to California because we do not enforce any laws, and you're able to use meth openly on the streets and you will not end up in jail. And what I've seen recently too is, we have moving encampments. First, we had about 200 tents on the Venice Beach boardwalk. So that was kind of, probably what you saw on the news, where there's assaults going on daily, there's shootings, fires. And eventually, it was just this huge public safety crisis. We witnessed triple-digit increases in crime. Eventually, our council members spent $5 million on the boardwalk in outreach. So basically, social workers went out and they told them, you cannot camp here, you must move on. And the state provided temporary hotel rooms. So eventually, once you offer somebody a place to sleep, then you can enforce the laws. So eventually that was cleared. But what we saw happen was soon after that, 70 tents emerged at Westchester Park. This is near LAX. And so of course there's 70 tents. The same thing happens where, before it was just this regular park. Now they're dealing with triple-digit increases in crime. So then our city council member went and he got $1.1 million to do the same plan, to basically send social workers out, and then the state provided the temporary housing. So that worked, and that encampment was cleared. But then guess what? All of a sudden we dealt with 45 tents near the Venice Library. And this was an encampment that really popped up just over the past month. There had been no tents there. And so I've gone out there multiple times. I've talked to the people there. There, I would say that about 98% are from out of state. And so that was really shocking for me to see that from an area that, had no tents to just explode, where it's the new area. And when I was there, people were openly doing drugs in front of me. So that was really, eye-opening for me to see and talk to a lot of the people there that were all from out of state.
So let me just be clear. So at first it was on the boardwalk, and later was next to LAX, and now it's outside of the library. And then do you think people are moving across those locations, or do you think, they're newcomers?
One of the individuals that I spoke to at the library, he had been part of the original encampment at the boardwalk. Mm-hmm. So you do see that all of a sudden one area starts enforcing laws and people are forced to move on. So I know that there are some people who have come recently. And so now the Venice Library, they're dealing with massive increases in crime. 2 weeks ago, there was a shooting at 3 a.m. It was a dispute among the people, living in the area, the homeless. And so the police came out, and the shooter has escaped. We don't know what happened to him, but they searched the tents, and there was 2 individuals that were from Colorado. They were wanted for, various felonies. They had jumped bail. So they were sent back to Colorado to await trial, but they had guns on them. So they had guns and ghost guns. So we see that, it does attract a criminal element. And that's the most dangerous part, that our elected officials are just unwilling to admit that this exists.
Wow. And on top of that, we also have Proposition 47, which says, if you steal items under $950, you basically just get a misdemeanor citation, which is a slap on the wrist, right? So and that probably also attracted a lot of, I don't know, like small time criminals.
And, the saying is the road to hell is often paved with good intentions. That's really what we saw happen here. Californians, they want to do the right thing. There are people in jail who shouldn't be there. And so we stopped enforcing many of our laws. We downgraded what otherwise would have been a felony to a misdemeanor. And you can't stack misdemeanors. You can go out and do as many misdemeanors as you want. And so now you can steal up to $950, and it's just considered a misdemeanor. And it's really the recipe for just this crisis, because people are going into Walgreens, they're smash and grabbing, or, even at, Louis Vuitton. So you can now go in and do smash and grabs. Think about it, most laptops are probably under $950. And then what happens is they go and they sell that stolen merchandise for drugs. So it's this perpetual cycle where, it's the worst thing that we could do for some of these people who are living on the streets and they're trapped by drug addiction. It's just this green light to go in and to smash and grab and, sell it for drugs.
Mm-hmm. So we know that a lot of times drug addiction is not only harmful, but also expensive. So how do some of the homeless drug addicts support their addiction habits?
Well, what we see is that a lot of people on the streets, they do receive checks from the government, disability, SSI. Anybody can apply for food stamps if you don't have an income. So that's worth about $400. And then with SSI payments, we're seeing people on the streets who are getting anywhere from $1,200 a month. I know in San Francisco with COVID, the extra payments, they were receiving up to $2,400 a month. So that's a lot of money if you're not paying for rent. And it's a really hard thing to, just get people to admit, but it is true. And we do not require people to have housing in order to receive their benefits here and use them. And another thing that's come up is, the drug dealers have really moved in. They dominate these areas. For the drug dealers, it's great to have encampments because you sort of have people corralled in an area. And what the drug dealers will do is they will just trade, their benefits for drugs directly. No need to go to a bank.
How do local residents feel about this whole situation, especially families with young children?
People are just so frustrated and fed up. People are just being victims of crime, just all the time. And sometimes it feels so petty. Someone will steal your bike. I mean, you literally can't leave anything out, but people will break into garages and they'll steal all sorts of things. And so it's just one of those things where, I know that in San Francisco, I'll look at all the smash and grabs happening there, but here in Venice, people are going into homes and just stealing as much as they can. Most of my neighbors on my block, I would say 3 out of the 10 people have already been home burglarized. My direct neighbor, she walks her dog at the same time every day. And so they must have been watching her because as she left, they came in, it was 2 guys, they saw it on their video and they stole as much as they could. And so that's scary when you realize that people are watching, your everyday movements. They know what time you get in at. And so we really just feel like, we have nobody on our side to really look out for us.
Would you ever call the police, or would the police come out? Or maybe you would feel, well, the police is not going to come out, so I'm not going to even report that crime.
And so they do come out, but it will take sometimes 45 minutes, maybe, an hour. Sometimes they don't come because there's just so much happening in Los Angeles right now that to get somebody to respond to a burglary, that's not very high up on their list. And that's right. Just, I've been in a position where I saw somebody, this was a different neighbor. I saw 2 men burglarize their home and I called the police. This was 2 years ago. And I waited for them. And it was about 45 minutes. And I waited for them. I wanted to make a report. But what we also see is because the laws are not being enforced, there are professional criminals now hiding out, under the homeless. And for them, it just makes sense because, of course, like there's no law and order. So they will hide stolen merchandise in tents. They will hide out under the homeless themselves. And police need to treat tents as private property. If a suspect is running and they run into a tent, they cannot follow that individual into a tent. They would need a search warrant, just as they would to enter a home. And it's the same for RVs. We treat RVs, the same thing that they would need a warrant to go into them. And we've also noticed this spike in gun violence. I didn't know this until recently, but it is legal to have a gun inside an RV as long as it's properly inside its case. But that really scares me because I don't want to walk by the RVs now knowing that they have guns.
I know you are a neighborhood council member, right? So what kind of responsibilities do you have, and what kind of power do you have in terms of speaking on behalf of the people?
Well, I don't really have any real power. Really, I am the local representative of my area. Our council member is supposed to listen to neighborhood councils. And unfortunately, our council member does not. So we do not have a good relationship with him. So that's sort of the problem. All we're asking for is that our laws be enforced.
Yeah. Then what is the next step in your mind? Do you think Venice Beach and other places in LA and San Francisco are just going to continue this terrible path? Or maybe the people are finally waking up and say, we are fed up by this and let's vote some sensible government officials with common sense.
2022, this is an election year in Los Angeles. It will be a new mayor, a new city attorney, and for us in Venice, it will be a new council member. I suspect that the most moderate approach, or really the most law and order approach, the most common sense approach is going to win. Voters are frustrated. I think that, sadly, the compassion is gone. I mean, we really do care about these people on our streets, but it has just been so long. It's just, too little, too late. And I think people are just so sick and tired of what's going on that I think it's, really just gonna be it's really just public safety. That will be the number one cause to get people out.
Yeah, nobody would ever say people in LA lack compassion. I mean, look at you guys. You voted for Proposition HHH, that's $1.2 billion. That means, people in LA, they do have compassion, they want to help. But I think the key is what kind of methods are we going to use to help? And a lot of times, I think, as you just mentioned, a lot of the methods are not efficient and wasteful. Mm-hmm. So we know some experts, for example, a professor at UCSF, Dr. Margot Kushal, she said, homelessness is not about mental illness and substance abuse. So how would you respond to statements like that?
Well, I would say that they need to come out here and they need to walk the streets. When you see somebody who is passed out in their own vomit, there's feces next to them and there's needles, you will see that it's not a housing crisis. It's a crisis of mental illness and a crisis of drug addiction. So for them, I think that they're just so out of touch. They need to come out here and see the encampments. There's no way to think that, somebody is just simply waiting for housing. This is a real crisis on our hands. And it's shocking that people are not willing to get sober and admit that we have a problem here, because this is a real problem. No, but there's this one study that I wanted to bring up to you. So this is a study, Recent Trends in Mortality Rates and Causes of Death Among People Experiencing Homelessness in LA County. This was put out January 2021. It was done by LA County Public Health. And what we saw, we actually invited the people who wrote this report to come speak to us at the Venice Neighborhood Council. And this is really what we saw. So the top 5 causes of death. So the number 1 cause is alcohol or drug or alcohol overdose. And remind you that a person experiencing homelessness is 35 times more likely to die of drug alcohol overdose than the general population. The number 2 cause of death is coronary heart disease. What we find is that they actually are related. One of our members who was on the Public Safety Committee, his brother was a drug addict living on the street. He was a longtime user. And when he died, it was ruled coronary heart disease. So we find that older people who have done, more drugs over their life, that's what it's ruled as. But so what you see here is that really number 1 and number 2 are drug related. And the number 3 cause of death is transportation related. This is when a person walks out onto the street and gets hit by a bus or a bike. It could be somebody walking into the metro. And that's so sad because this is a homeless person. It's a person. What a tragic way to die. And there you could say that this is related to drugs as well, or mental illness. The number 4 cause of death is homicide, and number 5 is suicide. So these are just, this is so tragic. And this is a report that's been put out there. And it's just, it's horrifying that, you know, people don't see this and do more about it.
Right. So what does PEH stand for? Is that
persons experiencing homelessness?
Okay. So that means, wow, this is like the odds ratio, right? It's like, you know, the homeless individuals are like 16 times more likely to die out of transportation related reasons.
And so when I see that, I think, well, then we need to get them off the streets.
Right, exactly.
Because right now we're basically, everything that we are doing is the wrong thing. And that's what this shows us. Mm-hmm. You know, we have been waiting for an update and it should have been out in January. It has not been published. And a part of me suspects that it's probably very shocking. We're waiting for the 2022 update to come out.
Wow. That is, I mean, thanks so much for sharing that with me. I mean, it is really sad to see the heightened mortality rate among homeless individuals for reasons that could be prevented if we do the things right.
That's right.
Yeah. So you mentioned the Linkage Center in LA, right? So what does the Linkage Center do?
Well, I had gone to visit the Linkage Center in the Tenderloin, and there, what they decided was it would be a quick link to basically get people off the street or provide people with a safe space and connect them to services. What happened was, you know, a few days after opening, there were these reports coming out that really it was just a safe consumption site, that people were doing drugs in the open. And so I went to go, you know, visit it and see it. And I was just horrified by it. You know, there's been rumors that we also have one opening here. The space that has been identified is our senior center. It's at Westminster Park. It is opposite our elementary school. It's, you know, right in the heart of our community. And so I went to go just see it. They call it a decompression center. So we still were not sure exactly where to be, but I went to go take a look in San Francisco and I was just horrified. What I saw was that you have this safe, you know, municipal run consumption site. And then all of the drug dealers are just lined up neatly outside. And to me, that was horrifying to see that, you know, I mean, because, you know, they're just waiting for people. They're waiting to sell them drugs and people buy their drugs and they go into the site. And, you know, it's just, how do we expect this is going to ever end? You know, we really have to think about, you know, what are we pushing? What policies do we have in place? Because from my perspective, I see that the policies that we have in place, all they do is guarantee that those living on our streets are going to die on our streets. And, you know, I'm a libertarian. So I used to believe in the legalization of all drugs and even prostitution. And that really changed for me a couple of years ago from living in Venice Beach. And when I see people who are using meth or heroin, I realize that they don't have free will. And so that's something, it's, you know, made me question everything that I've ever thought or thought I knew. And so I'm just seeing that these drugs are just so violent that it's just, you know, people just have no will. And it's really scary to be here. And I think that what the experts need to do is to evolve with what's happening on the streets. And at a certain point, they're going to need to pivot, that it's not the same population that they once, you know, studied or are talking about. It's changed so violently and so dramatically. And all we're doing is giving people a safe place to ruin their lives and die on our streets. You know, it's just, it's so horrific.
Do you feel people around you, maybe your neighbors, your friends, are talking about leaving California or Venice Beach?
Most of my neighbors with small children have already left. And that's just because it's too much for their kids to walk by. So really it's the people with kids, they're on their way out. It's, you know, I've lost so many of my neighbors over the past year. It gets so overwhelming. There's been times too where I've thought about leaving. You know, I own my house and my mother's told me that, you know, we should sell even if like I take a loss. And, you know, I don't want to, this is my neighborhood, but she tells me that it's not worth it. It's not worth, you know, something happening to me. So a lot of residents, they're in a real tough dilemma because our property values have just gone down. You know, in California, property values are on the up, but in Venice Beach, we're back to 2016 levels. And it's just because nobody wants to live here. So, you know, if you have enough resources, you can move to a nicer area. But for a lot of residents like me, I mean, I don't want to, I don't want to take a loss. I'm hoping that, our neighborhood will come back eventually.
Also, could you talk a little bit about the sheriff that you mentioned, who is protecting the neighborhood?
The sheriff has slowly become one of the most controversial figures in Los Angeles. To residents of Venice Beach, he really is an unsung hero. He's the only person out there fighting with the politicians and holding them accountable. And in return, they have slandered him and blasted him. They say that he is operating, under his own jurisdiction. It's not true. And, he is the sheriff of LA County. He has the authority to step in if there is a local public safety failure. And that's what we've experienced. I am very thankful that there is someone out there. He takes on so much heat. He gets attacked all the time, but he's really an advocate for someone like myself. And I do feel safer knowing that he's out there fighting with our politicians.
Why is he criticized by the politicians?
He's really basically the one advocating for law and order. He says that we must enforce, or we must regulate public space. And he's the only person saying that we need to start enforcing the law and that people will get arrested. Most of the politicians out there, they don't want to go that route.
So I guess maybe I'll end the interview by asking you, is there any final thoughts or any optimism, if there's any optimistic thoughts or ideas for the future?
I am optimistic for upcoming elections. I think it's going to be a real shock to people to see that LA could actually go the route of being moderate, of actually enforcing laws again. What's happened was that our elected officials they went too far left, and it's just enough is enough. I think that you are going to see a real return to common sense and law and order. And it's probably something that a lot of people are not expecting. But it's also something that, we saw this in San Francisco with the recall of the school board. At a certain point, people go too far left. And, what really needs to happen is we need to be moderate. We need to stay in the middle. Anytime you go too far left or right, it's just a recipe for disaster.
Well, thank you, Soledad Ursua. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with me, and please stay healthy and well.
Okay. And I'll send you this report and let me know if you have any other questions.